the role in terms of coordination of donors. So it has influence. It speaks to all the donors. It's kind of like an umbrella at the top of the umbrella. And it can cajole or perhaps try to influence donors in certain directions in terms of development policy. Okay? And that is why they wanted a paper or a report on potential development strategies. We should also remember that very recently the United Nations has been supporting the MINUSTAH's work on a broader level because the head of the United Nations went to Haiti. A Security Council mission went to Haiti this year, which is very rare, by the way, that a Security Council mission visits. And of course, the head of the United Nations recently, about 8 months ago, asked a very well-known economist, Paul Collier, to draft a report on economic development strategies for Haiti. How many people have heard of Paul Collier? A few people. The book, The Bottom Billion, it's won all of these things. So this was a big thing. Paul Collier's writing a report. It was all over. Paul Collier's writing a report on development strategies for Haiti. So everybody was waiting with bated breath. So what am I doing here today? Well, I'm not a big Paul Collier. I'm just a little Yasmine Shamsie. But I'm here to tell you that I have a few problems with Professor Collier's suggestions for economic development. And I'm going to give, because it's a short presentation, I usually have 10 problems, but I'm going to focus on 3, because this is a short presentation. Well, maybe 4. Well, 3.5. It depends if I had time. So the central pillar of Collier's document is aimed at attracting foreign companies or foreign firms into light manufacturing, otherwise known as maquiladoras. Okay? So he believes that the country should focus on the needs of the garment industry in Haiti. So the private sector that works in the garment industry, and the creation of export processing zones in various parts of the country is the way to go in terms of development. And his position is driven by 2 things that he actually outlines in his report. One is the lowest cost labor in the hemisphere, so wages that are miserable wages. And 2, the proximity and the preferential access that Haiti has to the U.S. market under a special act called HOPE 2. It's HOPE 2 because the U.S. gave preferential access to the U.S. market a few years ago, which was HOPE 1, and it didn't work. But now this is a little bit better. There's more access to the market, so there's HOPE 2. So he believes that with that preferential access to the U.S. market and the lowest cost labor, Haiti can be a good place for companies to come and invest and so on. Okay. Now I would add that there's a third issue here, and this is nothing that is in his report. It's just my own analysis, which is related to the concept of fragile states. Those of you who study international relations and who look at the security development nexus, you'll know that very recently in the literature we've been talking more about the links between security and development. And the notion and the concept of a fragile state is part of that whole discussion. And Haiti has been labeled a fragile state, which is better than a failed state. But still, of course, it's not a good thing. So what this has meant is that if you look at what donors did in the 1990s in Haiti and how they approached Haiti, which was pre-9/11. Let's keep that in mind. I don't know how you refer to 9/11 in Portuguese. Is that a well? Okay. I love that. Okay, it's like Coca-Cola. Yeah, everybody knows it. Okay, so pre-9/11, this idea that poor countries are more likely to experience conflict than industrialized countries or wealthy countries, and that fragile states pose a threat to Canadian, U.S., or European security and values. This hadn't quite developed into a full policy consensus in the 90s. It's post 9/11 that this kind of policy dialogue emerges, right? It's after the release of the former Bush administration's national security doctrine in 2002, where the Bush administration stated, and this is a quote, "America is now threatened less by conquering states than by failing states." So the biggest threat to American national security is a failing state. Okay, that was in 2002. So fragile states now have become, or have come to be viewed in a way, as the chief security threat of many Western states today. Okay? So we need to keep that in mind. And I'm linking this interest in export processing zones to that concept. And the way I do it is, why do we always focus on urban misery and urban poverty? There is a lot of misery and a lot of poverty in Haiti in rural areas. In fact, if you look at every statistic that the UNDP puts out, the poverty is greater in the rural areas. The services are poorer in the rural areas. People are leaving the rural areas in Haiti at 75,000 per year are leaving rural areas to come to Port-au-Prince. So that's the misery in rural areas. Yet we focus our development strategies on urban types of manufacturing, urban solutions. And one of the reasons, I think there are a number of reasons for this, and I developed that in a paper that I published, but one of those reasons is because of the instability that emerges, and it tends to emerge in cities, in Port-au-Prince. And international donors and the MINUSTAH are very concerned about stability. There isn't a problem out there in Pont de Verre. I just made that name up, it doesn't exist. Because I can't think of a small town, tip of my fingers. But there isn't a problem out there in the northeast or whatever. The problem is in those areas. So the policy focus, the media focus, the donor focus tends to be on that. So the link between conflicts, security, development, fragile states tends to put a spotlight more on the misery of the urban classes and social groups than those of the rural areas. So I got that in for you there. I wasn't going to talk about that, but I stuck it in. Back to Collier, which was my original point. So Collier comes up with this idea, but let's stress, this idea is not a new idea. Anybody who has studied Haiti knows that export processing zones existed in Haiti, and in fact, that they were quite successful. In the mid-1980s, before the fall of the Duvalier dictatorship, there were about 240 companies or multinational corporations based in Haiti. And they employed between 40 and 60,000 workers. There's a $20,000 person difference because different documents and books tell you different numbers. But whether it was 40,000 or whether it was 60,000, that's a lot of employment, right? And in 1985, 1 year before the dictator fell, Haiti was considered 9th in the world in the assembly of goods for U.S. Consumption. So it was a big exporter to the United States. And the subsector, the sector of assembly operations, of export processing zones, generated more than half of the country's industrial exports and earned 1/4 of its foreign exchange. So it was an important sector of the economy. But Haiti was poor, right? Haiti was poor.